Hello, hi. In this video, I would like to talk about human resource management in Japan. Yeah, and also in particular, what would be important for foreign companies, for foreign managers to understand how people think, how people can be managed. Today's talk is divided into two sections. In the first one, we'll talk about some general Japanese management principles. I think that's very important to understand the background of Japanese management, to understand also human resource management. And that will be part of the second section of today, when I will talk specifically about human resource management. To begin with, some of the management principles in Japan. Japan is well known for a long history and tradition. Some may say in American companies, they emphasize and they strive for profits. Japanese companies, in contrast, they strive for existence. Here are some examples of companies that have been existent for hundreds or even thousands of years. One example would be this Kongo Gumi on the left-hand side, where you can see this picture. It's an architecture association, or you could even say a planning architecture company. Then another one, Keikan, would be hotel, which has been existent since 7th century. So more than 1,300 years has been this hotel been running. And another example would be on the far right hand side here, Tanakaiga, which is a temple or souvenir shop, gift shop, which has been producing and providing all kinds of souvenirs and goods for temples. Also, that company has been existing for more than 1,000 years. So these are some examples of really old companies. I think also in Göttingen we have many old companies. And in fact, Japan has the highest number of old companies, or companies that are more than 100 years old. I think that gives you an idea that history, longevity, existence of prime importance for Japanese business. Some other general principles, thinking about corporate governance. Here we take Japan, Germany and the US as examples. One influence we've talked about before when we talked about the economic environment is about the influence of shareholders, stocks. In Japan, they have very little influence. Japan has a stock market, of course, the Nikkei, but shareholders have very little influence on the management and business of companies, which is in stark contrast to the US, where investors can execute very substantial influence, appoint managers, have an influence on major management decisions, and so forth. And that is related to who owns the company. In Japan, very often it would be financial institutions. Think of the keiretsu. We talked about that before, that there are some keiretsus where a bank plays a central role, which then owns part of different companies. Or other companies. This keiretsu system, where maybe we don't have a bank in the center, but we have many other companies, and they're cross-ownership, and they all own each other's shares to protect themselves, to cooperate together, and so forth. It could also be individuals, which is very different compared to Germany or the US. Aligned to that would be also that in terms of unions, we'll talk more about labor unions here, particularly also in our second section when we talk about human resource management, labor unions as one example. These are very often organized by company. So one company has its own labor union, and there's more a cooperative style. It's very unusual to see violent strikes. Whereas in Germany and US, very often these unions are based on industries. Remember recently we had Verdi, and the public sector association or union, which had a pay agreement for the whole industry, for all government officials. That system is common in Germany and the UK, US, but it's very different in Japan. We talked about longevity. Companies live long lives. The main purpose to continue to exist. Yeah, that's overall also the major goal, long-term growth or long-term existence, yeah, in contrast to American short-term profit orientation. And so there's a really long-term horizon in terms of HR-related aspects. That would also mean not only the companies should continue to exist, so also should the jobs. So that means high job security for Japanese employees. I've briefly mentioned this just before, the role of shareholders. In Japan, shareholders have very limited influence over management. Yeah, you may own some shares, yet it doesn't entitle you to execute a major influence. One reason is also, as we talked before, because there's cross-ownership. So there's partner company that could intervene on behalf of the company and block out any other investor or foreign investors. The focus is not on stocks and share price, the focus is on employees and consumer needs. I think that's also very important to point out. In Japan, when we talked about marketing, that companies are also very much focused on the consumer. Customer is king. Yeah, but so also employees play an important role. That means for companies, because they are less influenced by stock owners or shareholders, they have more autonomy, so the management can make decisions. And not completely independent. Yeah, these companies very often they operate in a keiretsu, but even if not, they have cross ownership, shared ownership, and so forth. There's lots of cross shareholding, so that means they would cooperate with their partner companies or their keiretsu companies. So in that sense, Japanese companies are not influenced by shareholders, but they're influenced by family or friendly firms or collaborative or keiretsu firms, and they serve in a role as shareholders, you would say. In recent years, also in Japan, we have seen some change. Yeah, so here I try to explain or introduce some of the traditional Japanese management principles, but of course we have the American influence, which also exerts some influence on Japanese management and also the role of shareholders. Let's talk about some other aspect germane to Japan, decision-making process. I think in short, we could describe it as a bottom-up culture. Yeah, it's not top-down, where you have a powerful CEO who makes decisions. It's quite contrary. So what we see a lot is what we call nemawashi. Yeah, so that means that there's some preliminary and informal way of communication, some bringing up some ideas at the very low level. That could be very low or medium level, where there's some kind of already forming of ideas and agreements. And the next step, there comes this Ringi. So there's more some formal and includes then the various stakeholders in this process. From the bottom, where we have some informal decision making, it goes up, including various stakeholders. And then later on, we have also this Ringi show. That means that we will also then, people would circulate proposals, paper, and then these various stakeholders will all sign or put their stamp, the inka on it, to agree. And then all the different parties involved would make formally write and sign their approval, and then any new decisions can be implemented. So the whole process takes a lot of time, but once implemented, everyone is on board, so there's no opposition, then it can also be implemented relatively quickly and also smoothly. Here we can also show you this in this chart. So step one, it could also maybe be that maybe the upper management, they identify a problem. Yeah, and it doesn't mean they already give instructions, but they identify there's a problem. Maybe there's low sales, there's a problem here and there, and then they will pass down some instruction to look into the problem. Yeah, but then how that is all be done is then at lower level. So maybe the lower management staff, they would analyze the situation, analyze the problem in step two, and then they would try to identify some solutions, identify different alternatives. They try to reach some consensus or at the lower level. Then they move back again to the middle management. Again, they try to achieve some consensus. and then it will be forwarded again back to the upper management to authorize to this solution, and then later on it can all be implemented. So some kind of a cycle. Now let's look into some more specific examples of excellent Japanese management practice. Probably all of you know Toyota. Toyota is an extremely successful car company. In particularly, Toyota has a relatively short history, and Toyota emerged as the most successful, profitable company producing the most cars in the 90s. Yeah, so 20, 30 years ago. Out of nowhere, Toyota emerged. It was highly successful in Japan and then conquered world market, including the US, Asia, and parts of Europe. Of course, here in Europe, we are very strong German, European car companies. Yeah, also, there has a much longer history. But Toyota took the world by storm. In particularly, it completely overcame and overtook all the American car companies. And Toyota, we talked about before, Toyota and other companies, to overcome the tariff barriers, they moved to the US, set up production, and then they took the American market by storm. And Toyota or Japanese cars were so much cheaper, so much faster, so much better than American companies. American companies were dumbfounded. They couldn't believe it. How is it possible that Japanese companies at the front, Toyota, is taking over America? And you can imagine then what American companies, managers, scholars did. They studied Toyota. They wanted to learn from Toyota. They wanted to benchmark, or you could also say copy and imitate Toyota. And that's exactly what happened. So MIT, many scholars, institutes, companies, they all tried then to imitate Toyota. Here's some of the main principles why Toyota was so successful. Genshi Genbutsu, going to the source, that's very much related to production. Kaizen, also very well known, it's continuous improvement. And then some other aspects which are also not uncommon in the US and elsewhere would be challenge, teamwork, and also respect. There's a video on the Toyota way which I would highly recommend you. Here, you can look it up here. There's a link. I think we will also put the link in somewhere in the documentation, also in the PowerPoint, so you can copy paste it later. I highly recommend you have a look at it to understand a bit more about Toyota, its founder and its management principles. Essentially, what Toyota did already back then in the 80s and 90s was imitated by more or less all other car and automotive supply companies, because Toyota's management principles and so forth were superior to all of its competitors. Also, I remember when I went to Bosch in Malaysia 10 years ago, they introduced and explained to us their production processes. Yeah, and they said, oh yeah, look here, Kanban, this and that. That's exactly how we saw it, and we learned it from Toyota, and we implement it here as well. Yeah, so meaning, just to give an example, how successful Toyota was. And then of course, because they were so successful, then it was imitated by almost all of their competitors. And then nowadays Toyota is still an excellent company and strong in production and so forth. Yeah, but these other companies imitating, they've closed the gap. So one of these principles is also just-in-time management. The idea or the concept only making what is needed, when it is needed, and the amount needed. So there is huge ramification for supply chain management, storage, warehousing, logistics, and so forth. And some of the principles are efficiency, also reduce waste, and by doing so to creating a competitive advantage or competitive edge. Another principle, which is not exclusive to production management, would be the idea of Kaizen, or continuous improvement, or you could also say quality management. What would be the typical thing? Whenever you produce or you do something, you realize, something could be done better. You identify a problem, or it doesn't need to be a problem, just a process, and then you see what you can do, and then you try to adjust, you make an adjustment, and then you check. And then if it works, Then you will standardize and implement it, not only in this one unit, but maybe also transfer to other units, and then it continue. So in daily operations, it would be you have continuous quality control circles, regular meetings, could be volunteers. Or I also remember when we visited a Japanese manufacturing company, it was quite funny. I thought, oh wow, the people are already done and they relax and they go home. No, they don't. Then they sit together and think about ideas how to improve certain processes and so forth. And that involves not just highly skilled, highly talented people, but includes everyone. In particular, also the people at the shop floor and so forth. All of them, they try to identify problems, or not even problems, just a situation, and think about ideas how to improve it. It can be a very tiny change, but it can also be a large one. And that continues. It's not just a one-time thing, but it continues. It's part of the work routine. Or as I gave you the example, if there's time, instead of just packing your bags and going home, then trying to sit together in teamwork and think about ideas how to improve. And that involves and includes commitment at all levels at the organization. And then once you have adjusted, you have the verification, you went through the cycle, and then you would implement it as soon as possible. And if it's very successful, you roll it out elsewhere. All right, so that was an overview into some of the key Japanese management principles. You may have heard about some of them in the other context. Many of these principles are relevant for human resource management. I think they're a foundation to understand some of the HR management policies, practices, and possible implementations for foreign companies when doing business in Japan. Let us think about some basic principles of HRM. We call the 3 pillars or 3 principles in Japanese management. Because they pervade all kinds of aspects of human resource management. They're related to culture. Remember, we talked about national culture of Japan, and so they're very important. So the 3 pillars or principles are first, lifetime employment. That's also very much related to this long-term longevity, job security. Meaning once you join a company, once you join Toyota, you will retire at Toyota. Maybe even your children will follow into your footsteps. Another major principle is seniority system. It's age-based society, seniority-based. That means how long you stay in the company matters, and then you move up according to the seniority within your organization. And the third principle would be enterprise units. Employees, they're organized within the organization, and they also try to pursue the goals of the organization. So there's also very strong alignment between the labor unions and the management of a company. All right, then let us go through the typical life cycle of a salaryman. Starting with university. So most Japanese young people, they would attend university. They graduate with a degree, with a bachelor degree, undergraduate degree, and then upon graduation, they will look for a job. First of all, congratulations, you graduated. And the next step would be then to enter a big kaisha, or a big Japanese company. That would be the typical dream of many Japanese students or young Japanese people. Then next, typically when you move, maybe if you move, you relocate, then you would move to a dormitory. Many big companies, they provide housing for the new staff members, or at least they provide some allowance. Then after, let's say 2 years later on, they get married. Japanese people get married a little earlier than Germans, so it's quite common upon graduation, working a couple of years, you get married. It's also fairly common to marry a colleague from within your own company. But then it is also then common that the wife, here it's a male-oriented society, a gendered society still, would then retire. The husband then, however, would continue his career inside this big company. Typically, he would rotate through different functions and through different also regions. Maybe he would have started in Tokyo, but then for a couple of years he will be sent to another city, maybe to Osaka or even a smaller city, while very often the wife and the family would stay home in Tokyo or wherever the main base is. Then, if fortunate or very common, he would get promoted. That's very common. The first couple of years promotion is almost guaranteed. No matter your performance, you get promoted to higher levels. And then after your long career, you would be retired from your own company. So your whole career is inside a company. Okay, so now let us talk specifically about the different HR functions or the different HR practices. We looked into the whole cycle of what it could be to work for a big Japanese company. Now let us start with the beginning. So recruitment. It is common that Japanese companies, they graduate fresh graduates from university. So they go to university, they have all kinds of joint efforts that companies would go to the university. University students go to special entry recruitment fairs. And there's still even now a relatively high recruitment rate, so that many graduates receive a job offer. By and large, Japanese economy, there's a scarcity of talent. That's good for job seekers, but that's also a challenge for organization. It's difficult for them to find highly qualified people. So it's mainly entry-level recruitment. And that is via university. So the big companies all have some sorts of agreements with universities. They send their staff for information sessions to university, or university students will be then forward all kinds of information so they can get in touch with the companies. And of course, also nowadays everywhere it's the internet. Also there are many internet job portals where students can sign up. And some portals are really convenient. You just press a button, you click, and then automatically the application will be sent to 10 different companies with very little extra effort. Newspapers are still being used, not so much at entry level, but also later. And then of course referrals for middle or senior level positions. For foreign firms, it's very different in most cases. Most foreign firms, they're relatively small in Japan. Because of their size, they cannot engage in all this university recruitment because it's expensive, time consuming, and then also you will have a young person who's not ready to do much work. So what most foreign companies then do is they recruit experienced people, so not fresh graduates necessarily, and then it's difficult to identify and to attract them. And to overcome this, very often then foreign companies, they will hire recruitment agents or headhunters who would then, on behalf of the organization, try to identify and help recruit qualified candidates for the company. Here are some examples. You can see the picture, these many people. It's a job fair. Then very often also here you would sit in interviews, assessments interviews as an exam. And then maybe there might be also interviews, group interviews. And then after several of these stages, then a job offer is being made to the candidate. So what are typical selection criteria for Japanese companies? What is extremely important is university reputation. Particularly the well-known big companies such as Sony, Panasonic and so forth, they can still pick. So most of these big companies are well-known companies. They have many applications. Smaller companies might not. But then if they have a larger pool of candidates, they would look first of all university reputation. There's some companies that have official, unofficial list of universities they recruit from. And these are the typical candidates. There are all kinds of rankings within Japan, such as Tokyo University, Kyoto University, Osaka University are well-known public university, or they were imperial universities. And then, of course, you have these famous private universities, foremost Waseda and Keio University. And then there are also a host of other good universities. What is also very important would be personality. Does the person fit to the organization? Do they have similar values? Social skills are important, networking and experience, but less so. So meaning it's somewhat different. The basic understanding is that these big companies, they would like to hire people that are smart. And the assumption is if they've graduated from a famous university, they've entered through very harsh entrance examinations, so they have a certain level of intelligence and they have also some motivation. Yeah, and then of course a fit in terms of personality, because the idea is these people are young, no matter what, they haven't learned much at university, so university will train these people, and so they want people that are smart and that fit to the organization in general, and then they can be trained, further on so that they can occupy important functions within the organization. Let us talk about a bit organizational culture. Yeah, that is very important. It's the background or the makeup of an organization, and it's highly related to then also HR practices. We have the US model and the Japanese model. Very often they are opposite. They're very different. In Japanese model with long-term employment, one of the three pillars, remember, which is in sharp contrast to rather low employee loyalty in the US. That then also means, because we have long-term employment, pay, we will talk more about later, is then also related to seniority or tenure. And the more longer you stay, and then also you get increasingly higher pay. It's a need-based, it's not really performance-based. Then openness to consider next career opportunities is very common in the US. You would seek your own individual opportunities inside and outside your organization. That is not really the case in the Japanese model. Japanese employees are very often risk averse, or whenever you switch, that is also entails certain risk, of course opportunities as well. And that then means also that for organizations, if you move up higher level, the pool of candidates is smaller because it's limited to internal candidates and not the large external talent pool of the whole country or maybe the whole world. And it's important then that there's a close fit between the individual and the organization already from the beginning, and then further these people are molded into the organization. Let us look into one example where we see some change, because change is inevitable. Overall, Japan has a declining demography. Companies struggle to find highly qualified people in Japan, so they need to find some ways how to enlarge the pool, because one of the problems of the current system is it's a limited talent pool. So the first one is, whereas in the past they exclusively focused on only a few top universities, they're now much more open and don't limit their recruiting efforts to a few universities. And second, while they were mainly looking at entry-level recruits, now they're much more flexible. And the entry-level system used to be once a year, because it's all on a cycle. The fiscal year in Japan starts in April. New recruits will start then in April. They will enter the company and so on. And they only used to take in once per year new recruits. Now it's much more flexible. New hires can start anytime. It's much more flexible. Not only at university level and not only at one point in time in a year, but multiple times and also different levels. Also higher level, which means they're job switchers in most cases, and they are also much more open to taking on employees from other companies also at higher levels. Interview was also much more flexible and being looked into, and also then Sony is not restricting itself to Japanese recruits, but also now they develop global talent pools, hire people outside Japan, in Japan, from other countries, and and then further develop them within Sony. So change is happening. Some companies embrace it more aggressively and openly, and others still wait. But that's a general trend. Also Japanese companies becoming more flexible in terms of recruitment. Now let us switch to the next HR function, training. So people are being recruited in the organization, then they need to be trained, developed. In some basics first. Still, many Japanese companies maintain their graduate recruiting approach and have maybe not once, but maybe a few times a year they take in new employees. But what is very important then to Japanese companies to have new graduate orientation trainings. You could also call it onboarding, more the Western term, but it's also somewhat specific because still in Japanese companies the fit is important, understanding the company because it's a long-term relationship. What is very typical component of such orientation training is to learn about the organization, learn about the corporate philosophy, learn about the organizational culture, and then of course also some technical knowledge. We talked also about before, and that also includes some very basic training at the beginning. That means how to take a phone call, how to greet customers, how to greet colleagues and so forth. That's all what then employees learn at the very beginning. Then of course you also have specific training before and after promotion to higher level positions. It could be just some general organizational, but also interpersonal skills, maybe also some technical skills if it's a more technical role. And then of course you have job specific or occupational training. Such as if you work in the finance department, you learn about financials. At the beginning, maybe you learn Excel sheets, but also later on, all ways of how to run all kinds of calculations or financials, issues and so forth. Or let it be marketing specific. So meaning within your specific function, you learn functional knowledge. In the US, that's what's most important, occupational training. In Japanese companies, that is of course also important. In some areas such as engineering, of course, that is also extremely important. But I think the point is here, Japanese companies go beyond just occupational training, but they all offer all kinds of general training, and firm-specific training, which is somewhat unique to Japanese companies. And also in general, training is very important in Japanese companies. They devote a lot of time and money on training employees. It could be included as development, which would be job rotation. Job rotation is very common in Japanese companies. And the interesting part is here that rotation goes in all kinds of different directions. It can be in terms of location, it can be in terms of function, and that is also expected. If you would like to move up into higher ranks in a large Japanese companies, they say you have to go through at least 3 departments for a year at least. It could be even extreme. You start in marketing, you move into finance, you move into HR and different units, different divisions of a company. And substantial time, not just a brief visit, but you should gain some substantial experience. The idea is so that you understand the whole company. And that applies particularly at the beginning for new graduates, but also to mid-level or even higher positions. And that goes then on to promotion to chief of a section. And that's also expected that you also rotated through at least 3 different functional departments. As I mentioned, could be marketing, finance, HR, for instance. And that leads to the general debate nowadays in Japan. Is it a generalist? Essentially, Japanese companies, they develop general managers because they have expertise in many areas. They know about finance, they know about HR, so they can connect the dots. However, because of that, they are generalists, they're not maybe specialists, they're not the most expert finance person, but because they've gained various experiences. in the US, we mostly have a specialist development path. Whereas in Japan, still general managers are important, particularly if you really want to move up to higher level positions. But that sometimes comes at the expense of having not that many specialists. Don't get me wrong, also in Japan, you have really experts in engineering, experts in finance and so forth. But that's not the only or the most common way. It's very often also developed general managers. Let us talk a bit about promotion and compensation. They're somewhat intertwined. In Japan, it's very much seniority based. So meaning you will be promoted based on seniority, not necessarily so much or based on performance. If you perform very highly or very lowly, it doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter as much. Of course it does matter to some extent, but particularly at lower levels, there's not much discretion. No matter how great you do or how poorly you do, you still receive bonus payments, because very often bonus payments are standard components of a compensation, particularly at lower levels, and will be paid once, twice a year, depending on the company. Could be several months pay or typical pay. And then you move up after 2 years, after 3 years, after 4 years, and so forth, based on your seniority. So seniority drives pay and promotion at lower levels. Of course, Japanese managers, they know who are the high performers. Maybe these people then they don't receive more pay, but maybe they receive more responsibilities or some job tasks that are more challenging or demanding or more exciting. Later on, after a couple of years, after 4 years, 8 years, 10 years and so forth, then they will distinguish low and high performers. Low performers will be promoted more slowly. High performers will be then also promoted more swiftly, and in particular to higher level. So that means very often the really high performers, they can reach to the very top, whereas the middle performers, they will never reach the very top. There's a certain ceiling, and the same would be for the low performers. They would never be able to reach to the top. But the point is here, at the beginning, everyone is same, and it takes time, and later on there's some kind of gap between low and high performance, also in terms of compensation. Also in general, the pay doesn't differ so much between low and high performer and low and top managers. Compared to the US or worldwide, Japan has among the flattest pay level, meaning CEOs and high level managers don't earn that much relatively. They still earn fine, but much less compared to their German or American peers. Here we can also see how pay develops over the life course. That's the national average. Monthly cash earnings by size of enterprise, gender and age group, men and women. First of all, what is very shocking, it's the same scale, you can see men earn so much more than women, or women earn so much less. Well, it's a very unfair gendered society. One of the main reasons why we have such a huge pay gap by gender is very simple, because women very often drop out of the labor force. They get married and then they stop working for a couple of years, and maybe they will take on part-time job later on, which doesn't pay as much. It's a huge pay gap in terms of gender. Then what we see in both cases for men and women, it goes up and down. The highest earnings happens around age 50 to 60. On starting, peaking, really going up also in the 40s. The idea very often in Japan, it's need-based pay. The idea is Japanese need the most money when they're in their 40s, 50s, because the understanding is, or the assumption is, they have children. And then children need to go to university, and university you have to pay, and so you get more pay, so to pay for all these additional expenses. As I mentioned before, it's not so closely linked to performance, it's more linked to age, seniority, and then also need-based. And then later on, the salary also goes down. Also, we have to consider retirement in Japan is relatively early. We talk about it in a second. Yeah, and then pay decreases again. Here about retirement. Official retirement age, actual retirement age, and also by gender. So the official retirement age in Japan and Germany is 65. It's in the process of increasing, lower in Korea. But then what is now interesting, look at Germany. Official retirement age 65. Actual retirement age among men 62.7. So meaning most Germans, they quit their jobs before they reach retirement age. So it's all kinds of early retirement packages and so forth. However, in Japan it's the reverse. The official retirement age is 65, but most people, particularly men, they work longer. They work until 69.3 on average. So even though they're being forced out of their regular jobs, they still continue to work several more years. Very often also, if they work for the large company, very often already at age 55 or 60, they're more or less forced out of their company and they find employment at another company. Yeah, very often, and these would be then the senior managers who are very capable. They're smart people, but not as good to move up inside these big Japanese companies, and then they look for opportunities elsewhere. Also, if they would have stayed at these big companies, they would have been driven out at age 65, official retirement age at latest, and they look for opportunities elsewhere. And then sometimes, what could also be a good opportunity for foreign companies to hire these very senior connected managers into a foreign company. Maybe in a role as a chairman or as a director, someone who can pull strings, who has the connections within the Japanese business community. And these people also, if they've maybe worked as an expat overseas, they would be very keen on taking on a senior role at a foreign company, even though it's a smaller one, but then they would have a fancy title on their business card, and maybe they can work a couple of more years and be active. And that we see quite a lot. You see the average age of retirement age in Japan. Of course, also in Japan, that's a different aspect we also have to consider. Pension system is not very generous in Japan. So many older people are simply working because they need money. That's of course a sad story, which happens in Japan but also in many other countries. Despite Japan being an industrialized economy, pension is not as generous as in many other countries. So some people simply work out of necessity. Let's think about retirement was one aspect, but it is also termination, meaning layoffs of employment, people being laid off. As we already talked about, that is not very common in Japan in general, because there's this long-term employment contract between employees and companies. So Japanese companies have been very reluctant to lay off people. The system not so uncommon to Germany. Also German companies try to avoid layoffs at all costs. But in Japan, we have witnessed recession or stagnation since the 90s, 30 years on. So it's almost impossible to maintain headcount and maintain and continue to exist for many companies. And before the whole company goes bankrupt, they need to reduce cost. And that means very simple, they need to lay off people. And that we have seen, but very slowly, and it's a long process. And the thing is also, no company would like to be first, but once some companies lay off, then they need to follow, because it's simply, that's the way it is in order to survive. But still, large-scale layoffs remain a social taboo, and companies try their utmost to avoid. So before companies send lay off people, they try all kinds of measures. Also, what is very common is that employees are being assigned to jobs that are rather meaningless, and very often then also the employees, they resign on their own accord, and they find some kind of agreement to leave the company. Overall, the turnover ratio in Japan is around 10%. It's still much lower than in many other industrialized countries. All right, let's switch topic. Let's talk about enterprise unions or labor unions. As we already talked about, unions are based on enterprises organized within each enterprise. So one company has its own enterprise or labor union and not organized via industries. There are 52,000 such units in 2015. In general, the idea of labor unions or enterprise unions is not really to increase pay. Yeah, that's the typical objective of most unions in Germany and other countries. Mostly increase pay and maybe also securing jobs. In Japan, that's also the main purpose, to secure employment. Raising wage is secondary, that's not their main purpose. And it's also they try to reach agreements, collaboration within the organization to maintain productivity, maintain existence of the organization, and in consequence also then to maintain jobs and long-term relationships. Labor disputes, as already mentioned, have not been a major issue. In the 80s and 70s there were some labor disputes, but it was mainly about labor rights, because that was also in the process when Japan emerged from a poor developing country to industrialized economy. Labor conditions were very poor at the beginning, so there were labor disputes back then, but since then labor right issues are not really an issue, and then there have been very few labor disputes and continue to decline. Let's talk a bit more about employee relationships or contracts. I think here we can first let me talk about different types of employment relationships. We have regular employees or permanent employees, semi or lifetime employment contracts. In Japanese we would call them seishain. They have unlimited full-time contracts, and the idea is really that they're the core employees within an organization. Then, in contrast, we have non-regular workers. They could be part-time, meaning they are on a part-time contract. Maybe they work only 30 hours or so. Or, what is also very common, we have temp staff or temporary staff. They're sent from agencies. There's also increasing proportion of these temp staff working inside organizations. Then we have seasonal workers, because only for high peak seasons and so forth. And then also we have contractual, for limited contract, 1 month to maximum of 1 year. So now we have on the right hand side, you see a figure. You see the number of employees in the different employment types. The red dotted line is about regular staff. We see a high proportion of regular staff has remained more or less the same. What we have seen now, a substantial increase in non-regular staff since the early 2000s and so forth. The point is here, companies and people distinguish between regular and non-regular workers. The main priority for companies is to maintain the jobs of regular workers, of seishain. The problem is they're expensive and difficult to lay off. And we have different economic cycles, ups and downs and so forth. And there's very little companies want and can do with regular workers, so they maintain them. But in order to be more flexible, to respond to different economic cycles, they've substantially increased the percentage and number of non-regular staff. Because non-regular staff can be easily hired and let go, and responding to economic needs. So that's what we have seen, a major trend in employee relationships in Japan. Trying to remain a relatively small core force of regular workers and increasing the number of regular workers to remain more flexible. Of course, this has all kinds of negative ramifications for the non-regular staff, because they receive less pension, less pay and so forth. yeah, and they're a more precarious situation compared to regular workers. Here's some general trend which is very important to consider in Japan: demographic transition. Yeah, over time. You see this figure on the horizontal axis. You see the years from 1950 to 2065, and then you see on the left hand side you see number in millions, and on the right hand side you see the age of people. And now we're in 2020, 21. What we know is Japan is the oldest society in the world, and also if you see the overall trend, it's shrinking. The Japanese population is shrinking and it's aging or continues to remain old. And if you look at the orange section 15 to 64, these are in general the people who are in the workforce. It's declining. And the consequence for companies is the labor force is shrinking. Fewer people, yet we still have demand for staff. So that means companies will compete for the decreasing size of the labor force. For foreign companies, that's even more critical because foreign companies have already difficulties hiring people. Now, even fewer people are available, and then all the Japanese companies and the foreign companies are competing for the same pool of applicants and candidates. Related to that, because you can think how to recruit or whom to recruit. One very obvious point in Japan is female representation in the labor force is rather low, in particularly at upper management level positions. Here we can look at Europe and Asia and have a comparison. The top management teams, executive committees and corporate boards. What we can see, also Germany is not doing too well here. And we have in the corporate boards, advisory boards, there's a substantial proportion of women, but executive committees even less so. In Germany less than 4%. In Japan, even in Asia, Japan is not well represented in terms of women in top management positions. That's really the top level. Then the interesting point is here in Japan, we have many women in jobs, in employment, 70-something%. It's the same or even higher than many other countries. But many of these women, they occupy non-regular jobs. They earn less money, have less secure jobs, lower pension. It's very unfair. The Japanese administration, the Japanese government, they're trying all kinds of initiatives to increase the number of women in employment and also management positions. In employment, they've already made great efforts and great improvements, but in top management level positions, they're still far behind. Of course, from an HR perspective, we would say it takes many years until these women move up. Now, from a foreign company perspective, it's a great opportunity because many Japanese women find fewer opportunities in Japanese companies. And then, now here's the hook, foreign companies can and have already done so in recruiting and promoting women within their companies. So that's a great opportunity, not only for Japan in general, but also specifically foreign companies to target and to hire then Japanese women and also to promote them into senior management level positions. So here are some examples from companies. Also Nissan, Japanese car company, they wrote, there's a lot of wasted time that the world can't afford to waste. They're referring to women. Here, one company, car, hatchback, looks a little bit like a Golf, VW Golf, is the result of a team led by women. So that's not only filling this scarce labor pool, but also it can create additional innovation. Goldman Sachs, a major American investment bank, they've also been aggressively hiring women in Japan. Also, the head or one of the senior managers also used to be a woman. And so they try to offer all kinds of initiatives to attract women, such as more flexible time and also backup programs for children and so forth, particularly considering the role of a woman as a mother and also enabling mothers to work for their company. Shiseido, a major Japanese cosmetics company, they introduced a kangaroo staff program, providing part-time employees to really full-time working moms. So supporting moms, that's the idea, because most Japanese women, as we talked about before, they drop out after getting married and after having childbirth. And here's the idea: to bring back working moms into the labor force. And then enabling the easy transition back to work for employees who took parental or personal leave. All right, then let me conclude. Japan has a unique management and corporate governance system. HR system is changing. I presented today the traditional Japanese HR, but also how it is changing somewhat to Western norms. Because they still want to maintain their cultural heritage, but they are also facing global pressure. And I also gave some specific ideas how and what foreign companies can do to succeed in their HR needs in Japan. All right, with that, I would like to conclude today. Thank you.